So I'm well aware that this class is college writing, not college literary analysis. One thing I'm trying to impress upon you, and it's something I know I tell you on the first day of the class, is that we're doing these theories, but we're not. Our top priority for doing them is not that we are learning how to interpret a text. That's important. I'm not telling you it's not. And we are reading some fictional text in this class. As I record this, the texts that we are reading in this class are Rufus at the Door, an anthology of short stories, Heart of Darkness, and Things Fall Apart. However, I'm currently on the docket to switch Heart of Darkness for another novel, and I'm sure some of you will be reading that very shortly. We will be interpreting the text through these different perspectives. We'll be using psychoanalysis, we'll be using gender, we'll be using feminism, we'll be using postcolonialism, we'll be using Marxism, we'll be using deconstruction, we'll be using, depending on the year. But my point is that it is valuable to use these to interpret a fictional text. It absolutely is. However, our top priority for going through these theories is not to interpret other texts, but to inform how we, the writer, create our own text. What perspectives will we fall under? Now, many of us naturally find ourselves falling into certain theories, just based on who we are as a person. For example, in my own work, when I write, I tend to look at things from a very Marxist slash deconstructionist perspective. That's just kind of how I look at stuff. So it's convenient to have the terminology to back me up. Some of you probably very much like postcolonialism, even if you've never heard of postcolonialism. This is meant to help you as a writer. But we do look at other things. Now, for example, here on the screen, we have 3 articles. Some we may read, some we may not. They are all in your anthology that I checked out to on the first day. The first is I Want a Wife. Then we have Panacea. And we also have a fictional story by Kate Chopin called The Storm. These are great texts for understanding how a writer uses gender theory to write something. So let's think back to feminist theory, because gender theory is based upon feminist theory. There were some major pieces to that puzzle to understanding what feminist theory is. The first one was just, how do men and women fit together? How do they get along? What are their relationships like? Also, what does power look like within a patriarchy? And that is, again, a male-dominated society. Lastly, what are the roles of masculinity? In that given society, what does a man do? When I say masculine and feminine, when we're talking about gender theory, we are talking about male, female, biological male, biological female. Very restrictive in that sense. We also talk about the weakness of femininity as it's portrayed, or the strength of femininity as it's portrayed. Historically, in a patriarchy, masculinity is seen as strong and femininity is seen as weak. And lastly, we look at an examination of the established literary canon, the established point of view of our culture, and how it conforms to male-female relationships and the patriarchy. So, gender theory is very closely related to feminist theory. But, as I said before, and as I said in feminist theory, the video that you watched, feminist theory examines male and female. It examines how a patriarchy controls feminine traits. Gender theory is completely different. Gender theory takes that and says, well, so what? Gender theory asks why. Gender theory is very much a deconstruction of feminism. Gender theory examines the following ideas. The top priority, sexuality. Gender theory is often called the queer theory, and it came out in the mid-90s to explain it, and it's because it deals with LGBTQ plus rights. It also examines how that sexuality equates to power. This is where we start to think about not only how does a man hold power, but how does a person who embodies masculine traits hold power? How does a woman, for example, with masculine traits be degraded because of those traits? And also we look at marginalized populations in literature and culture. Emphasis on the culture. The most important thing you have to remember is that gender theory is influenced by feminist theory. And for those of you who in the future write a paper, I'm going to have you write a few literary analysis papers, and I'm also going to ask you to write some things for me, obviously. And there will be points where you'll say, I don't know if this is gender or feminism. And that's because it blurs together a lot. That's the fun part of this, is Worry a little less about that. Gender theory is influenced by feminist theory, but you are a gender theorist if you are concerning yourself with the role of sexuality and gender identity, as well as just male female traits and ideals. So ask yourself, how is gender and how is sexuality discussed? I don't know about you. I love gender theory. Feminist theory, I like. It's fine. In terms of writing from that perspective, it's fine, but it's very restrictive. Gender theory is very unrestrictive. So, while feminist theory is effective in changing how you read something, saying, oh, well, the male character does this, the female character does this, or you as a writer, I do this as a man, or I do this as a woman, there are parts of feminist theory that are kind of just same old game. They don't question things. They just point to what stuff is. They don't judge it, I guess the best way to do it. Gender theory works away from that male and female binary, and it says, you know what? It doesn't exist. The male-female binary, we made it up. We made it all up. It doesn't exist. Biologically, it doesn't exist. Socially, it doesn't exist. In order to counter the construct of the same old game, rather than just saying, oh, there are men here and there are women here, we counter the patriarchy by working away from the dialogue and the language of that male and female binary. So, just in case you don't know, binaries. Binaries are opposites. They do not exist. That's the easiest way to put it. A binary is a social construct. We say something is opposites. They're not. It's an arbitrary statement. Black, white, up, down, male, female. These are words that we attach to things. Feminist studies just looks at how that binary exists. Gender studies looks at the binary and says, it's kind of a bunch of nonsense. Let's get rid of it. Cultural definitions of sexuality and what it means to be male or female are very much in flux with the gender theory. We'll talk about that a little in class, I think. We have an example here. 30 years ago, women couldn't wear a baseball cap, and men couldn't wear comfortable frilly shirts. 100 years ago, men could wear those frilly shirts. That was masculine. Feminist theory examines that existence. I mean, it's so arbitrary. Pink is girls and blue is boys. Why? That's what feminist theory looks at. Gender theory breaks down the assignment of those ideas, and it examines how alternative identities become repressed in the presence of those ideals. Girls, your grandparents, not that long ago, if the women wore dresses, they were gay, and then those women would be potentially lobotomized. We're talking about a world in which being gay was cause for a forced lobotomy in many cases, and there's plenty of recent pop culture examples of this in action, and they're not really exaggerations. So gender theory looks at that and says, what's wrong with us? Why are we doing this? This is idiotic. It's like, okay, sure, women couldn't wear baseball caps 30 years ago. Why is that suddenly a determiner of male versus female? Your frilly shirts, why is that a determiner of who you are? Why is that part of an identity? What makes that? Why do we make that up? We make it up. Now, gender theory, you're asking a few typical questions, and I'm hoping at this point, now that we've done a few theories, these questions are going to be pretty simple, because just like our other theories, our conventional theories, I should say, they always deal with power. How does one person or one group hold power over other groups? And that's socioeconomically, politically, whatever. First, what elements of a text can be perceived as masculine, that is active, powerful, decisive, versus feminine, passive, marginalized? And how do those characters support those traditional roles? What support is given to characters who question that binary? What happens to those elements? What happens to those characters? If we have, there's a novel I highly recommend everybody read. It is my absolute favorite novel of all time. It is called The Bell by Iris Murdoch. And the primary protagonist of that novel, not to spoil too much, towards the end of the novel, she takes up athletics. And throughout that novel, a huge part of it is just the traditional role of men versus women, and women are not athletic. That's the point. They are sheltered. They are kept away from the sun. They are dainty and delicate. And a huge part of her character growth at the end is her just saying, well, screw this. And she takes up swimming. I mean, there's an entire chapter devoted to how free she feels swimming through a lake. The the language that Iris Murdoch gives to that character, describing the feelings that she has and the way she fits into the world that's been created for her, that tells you very much what Iris Murdoch is questioning about that male-female binary, which is that she finds it to be nonsense. Also, what elements in a text might exist in the middle between that perceived masculine feminine binary? In other words, what elements, what characters may exhibit traits of both, and how are they treated within the text? How does the author present the text? Is it a traditional narrative? Does it have an introduction? Does it have a relative normal rising action, a climax to the story, and falling action with everything ending in perfect harmony at the end? Or does things get kind of chaotic and insane? Structure of a text is very interesting. I recognize that's not for everybody, but it's very interesting. Also, what are the politics, that is, the ideological agendas of any specific gay, lesbian, or queer works? That is, how do we look at those works? And how are these politics revealed in the work's content or characters? That is, if person A burns a house down in a conventional novel, do we treat that novel differently than if person B in a separate novel, a gay novel, burns down a house? Stupid example. Whatever. You get the idea. What are the poetics of specific lesbian, gay, or queer works? Now, this one works especially well for you as a writer because part of our structure in terms of writing, the purposes that we employ, is descriptive writing. What are the literary devices and strategies that we use as writers, as well as what do we see as readers in lesbian, gay, or queer works, or conventional works that we can reinterpret in new ways and throw things up in the air? How does the work contribute to our knowledge of queer, gay, or lesbian experience and history, including literary history? There is a history that we know where a little boy grows up and he only likes girls because he's a little boy and that's the way he is, or a little girl grows up and she only likes girls, and they have children, they get together, they live their life, and they die. That's the history we know. This lens, kind of like the post-colonial lens, kind of looks at a hidden truth. Now I have an example for you. Mercutio, character from a play that we have all read, Romeo and Juliet. A gendered interpretation of Romeo and Juliet highlights that Mercutio is not just a conventional guy who hates love. No, Mercutio, in fact, holds a burning love for Romeo, and everything that informs what Mercutio does in that text can be interpreted as he loves Romeo, and he is going insane under the knowledge that he will never receive a healthy love back from Romeo. There's a hidden truth revealed in there when we look at it from a gendered theory. Also, how might the queer, gay, or lesbian experience be coded in texts that are written by writers who are apparently homosexual? That is, how can we use a gender theory to talk about the author of a text? I'll be honest with you, I don't care a whole lot about the authors, so I use this relatively rarely. And in your perspective, you are the authors, so this will become very interesting for you, you as straight or gay authors of your own work. How will you create the language of this experience? Or how do traditionally straight characters exhibit alternative gender identities? That is, not too long ago, we came up with this binary of gay and straight. They exist now. We made it up. They didn't used to exist. They do now. So people who are traditionally called straight, how might they have traits about them that would not be considered straight? To be really, really facile about the whole thing, a boy who cries is called what? TikTok. I bet you know. You have the word in your head. It's the theory. Just because a boy cries does not mean that boy is gay. Just because a girl plays a sport does not mean that girl is gay. Just because a person likes monster truck rallies does not mean that person is straight. How do traditionally straight characters exhibit alternative gender identities? And what does the work reveal about the operations of homophobia In what way is our entire legal system, our entire social construct built around homophobia? In what way do we, again, just like with our other theories, when we deal with that idea of the other, in this case, the other is that who may not embrace traditional gender roles. Homophobia. How do we treat that person? And how might a literary text illustrate the problematics of sexuality and identity? That is, how might human sexuality not fall neatly into those separate categories that are defined by the words homosexual and heterosexual? And what does the text reveal about the conflict or the clash that's given when the gender identity is repressed? I want to point something out at this point, and I'm doing it because I didn't want to do it in the beginning, and I don't want to forget and not do it at all, so I'm just doing it here. Just like post-colonialism, this is not an excuse to bash people who are not gay. It is not a critique against you just because you are not queer. It is simply an examination of why we create the binaries that we create. Much as I warned you very carefully in post-colonialism that it's not about feeling guilty for being white if you are white. It's about identifying that the world we have made, I want to point out, not the world that just existed one day. It's the world we have made through the language that we use, has created these binaries. Why do we have them? That's the most important question you can ask. Why does this exist?